Good evening, and welcome back to the best Game of Thrones lore to sleep to. The question of who was the greatest fighter in Westeros does not begin in the dust of the Red Keep, with a Dornish prince circling a giant in the sunlight while a court holds its breath. It does not even begin on the tourney fields at Harrenhal or Ashford or Lannisport, where the singers gathered and the crowds paid their coppers and the champions were crowned in flowers. To understand who the truly dangerous men and women of this world were, we have to go somewhere much quieter and much colder, to the practice yards before dawn, where boys of 6 were handed wooden swords and told to hit each other with them, and where most of what separates a living knight from a dead one was decided years before anyone had heard his name. Because the fighters we remember are not always the fighters who were best. Reputation in Westeros was made by singers, and singers are paid. A tourney champion might never have killed a man. A slaughterer of hundreds might have died unremembered in a ditch, because nobody with a harp happened to be watching. The greatest swordsman of an age might have been an old man with bad knees who simply refused to lose. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And while you're getting comfortable, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and whether it's cold where you are. I always love seeing how far these quiet late-night journeys reach. Now, dim the lights, let the fire burn down to embers, and let's begin. What makes a great fighter in Westeros? Before we can rank anyone, we have to agree on what we are ranking, and this is harder than it sounds, because there are at least 4 completely different skills that all get called being good at fighting, and almost nobody in Westeros is good at all 4. The first is the tourney. Jousting and the melee are sports. They are conducted in daylight on level ground with rules, with heralds, and with a maester waiting nearby. A great jouster needs balance, timing, a strong seat, and a very good horse, and the skill transfers to a real battlefield less than people assume. The melee is closer to real war, a great mass of armoured men beating each other with blunted weapons until only one is standing. And the men who win melees tend to be the men who win real fights, because a melee rewards stamina and awareness, rather than a single perfect moment. The second is the duel. One man, one other man, no crowd, no rules, and no ransom. Duels in this world are far rarer than the songs suggest. Most of the famous ones we know about were trials by combat, where the law required them, and a trial by combat is a strange thing, because a man may be fighting for a cause he does not believe in, against an opponent he has no quarrel with, in front of a god he suspects is not watching. The third is the battlefield. This is a different creature entirely. On a battlefield, a man fights for hours, not moments, in armour that weighs as much as a small child, in mud, in the dark, half deaf inside his helm, unable to see anything to his left or right. He is not fencing. He is surviving a crowd. The best battlefield fighters are not usually the most elegant. They are the ones with lungs and patience, who know how to stay near their banner, who understand that the man who panics first dies first, and who have learned that most of killing in a mass of men is done with a dagger through a visor slit, while somebody else holds the fellow down. And the fourth, which almost nobody counts, and which decides more of this story than any of the others, is simply not dying. Longevity. The ability to be in 100 fights and walk out of 100 fights. Many of the men on this list were spectacular, a smaller number were spectacular for 40 years. Then there are the physical facts, and they are brutal and unromantic. Armour matters more than skill. This is the single most important truth about combat in Westeros, and it is the thing the songs lie about most. A man in full plate is very close to invulnerable to a sword. You cannot cut plate, you can barely dent it. Fights between armoured men are not about slashing at all, they are about wrestling an opponent to the ground and finding the gaps at the armpit, the groin, the eye slit, the back of the knee. A brilliant swordsman in leather will lose to a mediocre one in steel almost, every single time, and the story shows us this again and again, and we keep forgetting it because it is not the version we want. Reach matters. Size matters. Strength matters enormously because the weight of the weapon and the weight of the armour and the sheer hours of it will grind down a smaller man before skill has a chance to speak. Speed matters, but speed is the young man's gift and it leaves early. Most knights in this world are past their best by 35, and then there is Valyrian steel, which is not a myth and not a legend, but a genuine and decisive material advantage. There is perhaps a few hundred blades of it left in the world, forged by a civilization that is 400 years dead by methods nobody can reproduce. It holds an edge that never dulls. It is far lighter than ordinary steel of the same size, and it will cut through common iron and, more importantly, through the mail and padding that fill the gaps in plate. To give a great fighter a Valyrian blade is to give him an advantage that no amount of training can answer. One more thing, and this is the caution that has to sit underneath everything else in tonight's list. Almost all of our evidence is testimony. We know these people were great because other people in the story said so, and those people had reasons. A squire remembers his master as a god. A rival remembers a champion as overrated. An old knight remembers the men of his youth as giants, as old men always do. And the accounts that survive in the histories are the accounts that somebody thought worth writing down, which is not the same as the accounts that were true. So we are not really ranking fighters. We are ranking legends, and doing our best to guess at the fighters underneath them. We will begin at the bottom and work our way up, and we start with a man who does not belong on any list of the great and who would find it very funny that he is here. 10th, Bronn. He has no house, no lands, no proper name, and no history that anyone bothered to record. He is a sellsword out of the Reach, or the Stormlands, or somewhere in between, depending on which version of his own story he is telling, and every version of it is a lie told to whoever is buying the drinks. He came from nothing. He was almost certainly a soldier's son, or a soldier's mistake, and he learned to fight the way most common men learn to fight, which is badly and by accident and in situations where the alternative was dying. He should not be in this company. Every other name on this list is a champion, a lord, a knight of renown, or a monster of legend. Bronn is a killer for hire with a bad attitude and no sense of shame whatsoever. And he is here because of one afternoon in a mountain castle, and because of the thing he understood that almost nobody else in Westeros ever quite grasped. He was hired to fight a trial by combat in the Vale, in the High Hall of the Eyrie, on behalf of a small man who had been accused of murder. His opponent was the captain of the household guard, a seasoned knight, older, heavier, wrapped from throat to boot in plate and mail, with a shield and a good sword and 40 years of proper training behind him. On paper, it was not a contest. It was an execution with extra steps. Bronn came out in almost nothing. No shield, light leather, no helm to speak of, and then he simply refused to fight. He walked backwards, he circled, he put furniture between them. He went over a table and around a pillar and down the length of the hall, always moving, always just out of reach, letting the older man in his 80 pounds of steel chase him across the polished floor, in front of the entire court. The knight bellowed at him to stand and fight like a man. The lords in the gallery jeered and called it cowardice. Bronn kept walking. He was not running away. He was spending the other man's strength. He had looked at the problem the way an accountant looks at a ledger, and he had seen that his opponent had a fixed amount of air in his lungs and a fixed number of swings in his shoulders, and that plate armour on a hot day in a stone hall is a slow poison, and that all Bronn had to do was be somewhere else for long enough. When the knight finally slowed, when the sword began to drop between blows and the breath started sawing inside the helm, Bronn came in for the first time and put his blade through a gap in the armour, and it was over in seconds. Then he tipped him out of the great hole in the floor, of that hall through which the Arryns dispose of their enemies, and turned around and looked at the lords who had been calling him a coward, and said nothing at all. They asked him afterwards whether he had truly fought without honour. He agreed that he had. He pointed out that his opponent had fought with a great deal of honour, and was currently somewhere at the bottom of a mountain. That is the whole of Bronn's philosophy, and it is worth taking seriously, because he is one of the only characters in this world who has correctly identified what fighting actually is. Everyone else in Westeros is playing a game with rules that were invented by lords for the entertainment of lords, and they have confused the rules with reality so completely that they will genuinely stand still and let a man they could have outrun kill them, because moving would look bad. Bronn kills people. That is the job. He does not care how it looks. He will not fight opponents he cannot beat, and he is entirely open about this. When the same small man later needed a champion against the largest and most feared knight in the Seven Kingdoms, Bronn declined without embarrassment. He explained his reasoning in detail. He would probably die, and there was no amount of money that could be spent by a corpse, and the small man was not paying him enough to be a hero, because nobody could pay him enough to be a hero. He knew exactly where the edge of his ability was. That is rarer than any amount of skill, and it is the reason he outlived almost everyone else in this story. And yet, for all the cynicism, he was not quite the mercenary he claimed. He fought at the Blackwater when he could have run. He kept coming back to the man who had first hired him long after the money had stopped making sense. There was something in him, underneath the arithmetic, that he would not admit to and never once explained. He ends the story a knight, a lord, married into a castle, with lands and a title and tenants, which is to say that a boy from nowhere with no name at all beat a system that had been designed for 8,000 years specifically to keep him out of it. He did it without ever once winning a fight fairly. There is no man on this list he could defeat in an honest duel. There is no man on this list who managed what he managed. 9th, Ser Jorah Mormont. He was born on an island in the cold northern sea, on a rock covered in pine trees and moss, the heir to a small and poor house, whose bare sigil was older than most kingdoms, and whose entire wealth would not have paid for a week of a southern lord's table. Bear Island breeds hard people. Its women fight, which is almost unheard of as the rest of Westeros, and its men are raised knowing that if the Sea Raiders come, there will be nobody arriving to help. Jorah Mormont was a genuinely accomplished knight before he was anything else, and this gets forgotten because of everything that came afterwards. He was knighted for valour at a siege, on a wall, in the worst kind of fighting there is. He fought his way into a rebel stronghold among the first men over, which is the position that kills more knights than any other, and he did it well enough that the king himself took notice. And then, at a great tourney in the west, in front of a crowd of thousands, he won the whole thing. He unhorsed some of the finest jousters in the kingdom on his way to it, including a young Lannister, who was already being spoken of as the best sword alive. Jorah Mormont was for one afternoon the champion of Westeros, and he crowned a beautiful southern woman his queen of love and beauty, and he married her, and that decision destroyed his life. She was expensive. Bear Island was not. To keep her in the manner she considered ordinary, he began selling poachers to slavers, which is a crime in Westeros so far beyond the pale that the Warden of the North rode out personally to take his head for it. He ran. He crossed the narrow sea. His wife left him within the year, and so the tourney champion of Lannisport became a sellsword in the free cities, and this is where his real education happened. He spent years fighting in wars that had no songs written about them. He served in the disputed lands, where the same handful of miserable towns have been fought over for centuries by companies who change sides for coin. He fought under commanders who were criminals, alongside men who would kill him for his boots, in a style of warfare with no chivalry in it at all. He learned the Eastern weapons and how to beat them. He learned to sleep in armour. He came out the other side of it a completely different fighter to the young knight who had won a crown of roses, and a considerably more useful one. The moment that shows what he had become came in a Dothraki camp, when a blood rider came at him with an arak, which is a long curved blade halfway between a sword and a scythe, and a terrifying weapon in the hands of a horse lord. Jorah was in mail. The Dothraki wore nothing but a leather vest and painted skin, because in this sea of grass armour is considered cowardice and weight, and because for their entire history they had fought other people who also wore nothing. The arak came down on Jorah's arm and rang off the mail, and that was the end of the fight, and the end of the argument, and Jorah simply cut the man down while he was still working out what had gone wrong. It took perhaps 4 seconds. It is the single clearest demonstration in the entire story of the point we made earlier. Steel beats skill. A brave and gifted warrior in leather loses to a competent man in mail, every time, and the horse lords lost an empire's worth of future to that one truth. Later, in the east, Jorah fought in the fighting pits, and in the pits nobody cares who your father was. He fought as an old man, with a bad shoulder and a body that had been broken and reset a dozen times, against younger and faster opponents, and he won repeatedly, because he had spent 30 years learning where a man's weight goes before he swings. He was never the most gifted swordsman in any room he stood in. He was patient, durable, technically excellent and utterly without flourish. And the reason he is on this list is that he fought in every style of combat this world has, in the west and the east, in tourneys and sieges and pits and open battle, across 3 decades, and he was still standing at the end of it. He was also, from the moment he first knelt to a frightened girl in a foreign city, entirely and hopelessly loyal to somebody who did not want him, and he never once used a sword to try to change that. There is something in that worth more than the fighting. 8th, Sandor Clegane, called the Hound. He was never a knight, and he would have spat at anyone who called him one, and the reason for that goes back to a nursery in the Westerlands when he was 6 years old. He picked up a toy. It was his older brother's toy, a discarded wooden knight, and his brother found him with it. His brother was 11 and already the size of a grown man, and he did not shout and he did not strike him. He took the boy by the neck, carried him to a brazier, and held his face down in the burning coals while he screamed, and held him there and had to be pulled off by a servant. Their father told the household it had been an accident with the bedding. Nobody contradicted him, because their father had seen exactly what a boy of 11 had done and had understood what he would become at 20. Sandor Clegane grew up with the right side of his face melted into a ruin of scar and bone, with an ear mostly gone and an eye that never quite closed, and with the knowledge that the world had watched it happen and had decided to call it an accident. He was terrified of fire for the rest of his life, so terrified that it could stop him in the middle of a battle he was winning, and he never once apologized for it. Everything he is grows out of that afternoon. He looked at the whole apparatus of knighthood, the vows and the flowers and the 7 oaths and the anointing oil, and he saw that his brother had been made a knight by the king himself and was permitted to do whatever he liked, and he concluded correctly and unanswerably that the entire thing was a lie invented to let strong men hurt weak ones while being applauded for it. He refused the title all his life. He was the finest fighter in the royal household, and he insisted on being called a dog. As a fighter, he is enormous, nearly 7 feet, heavily built, and unusually fast for his size, which is the rare and dangerous combination. He fights without much subtlety and with total commitment, using weight and reach and a willingness to keep coming forward that breaks people before his sword ever needs to. He wears a helm shaped like a snarling hound's head, and he understands perfectly well what that does to a man standing across from him in poor light. His best documented fight was a trial by combat in a cave in the Riverlands against a lightning lord leading a band of outlaws, and it is worth telling because of how it went. His opponent set his own sword on fire. Understand what that meant. Sandor Clegane, who could not look at a hearth without flinching, was made to fight a burning blade in a dark cavern in front of a hostile crowd, on a charge he was innocent of, for a god he did not believe in. He was so frightened that he could barely make himself advance. He won anyway. He took a wound doing it, and his shield burned on his arm, and he cut the man nearly in half. Then he stood in the firelight shaking, alive, acquitted by the judgment of a god he had just spent the whole fight calling a lie, and the outlaws had no choice but to let him go because they had asked and been answered. The strangest thing about him is what he did afterwards. He took a girl with him. He had no reason to. He spent months hauling a furious northern child across a ruined countryside, feeding her, teaching her where to stab a man so he dies rather than merely bleeds, arguing with her constantly and trying to sell her back to her family, which was the excuse he gave himself for keeping her alive. Her family kept dying before he could deliver her. He was cruel, and he was violent, and he had done unforgivable things for the Lannisters, and he also carried a child through a war zone for no profit whatsoever and never once explained why. And here we come to a difference that has to be marked, because it is one of the largest in the whole story. On screen, the Hound's Road leads to a famous duel on a clifftop with a woman in blue armour, and he loses, and he is left broken on the stones. That fight never happens on the page. In the written account, his end, if it is an end at all, comes quietly. He's wounded and taken in by silent brothers on an island of penitence in the river, and there is a very large man there who digs graves, who does not speak, who limps, and whose face nobody describes. The story never confirms it and never denies it. It is one of the gentlest things in the entire series, and it is completely absent from the version most people know. The dog was rabid, and everyone said so, and the only person in the story who was ever safe around him was a child who could not defend herself. 7th, Brienne of Tarth. She was born the only surviving child of the Evenstar, the lord of a beautiful and unimportant island in the narrow sea, and she was born wrong for the world she was given. She grew to well over 6 feet. She was broad through the shoulders and thick through the arm, with a face that had been broken and reset more than once, and had not been much to look at before that. Her father, who loved her, tried 3 times to arrange a marriage for her, and 3 times it collapsed in humiliation. And one of those times the young men of a garrison ran a wager among themselves about which of them could bed her, competing for the entertainment of it, and she found out. That is the fuel. Everything about Brienne of Tarth is powered by the fact that from childhood she was treated as a joke by the world, and she decided that if she could not be a lady, she would be the thing the song said was better than a lady, and she would be so good at it that they would have to stop laughing. They never stopped laughing. That is what makes her the most quietly heartbreaking figure on this list. But she is extraordinary. She trained obsessively, for hours a day, for years, in a discipline that nobody wanted her to have, and no master at arms wanted to teach her. She has the raw strength of a strong man, and she has spent her life aware that she cannot afford to lose a single fight, because a defeat that another knight would shrug off would be used to prove that women should not hold swords at all. Her great public moment came at a melee at a river crossing, a full melee, 116 armoured men in a field beating each other unconscious for a prize. She entered it in plain armour with her visor down, and nobody knew who she was. She lasted the entire thing, and at the end of it she was standing over the most celebrated young knight in the 7 kingdoms, the golden boy of the Reach, the champion of 6 tourneys, and she had put him in the mud. The prize was the right to choose. She could have asked for gold. She asked to be allowed to serve. Then there is the fight in the woods, which is the one everyone remembers, and which is more complicated than it looks. She was escorting the most famous swordsman in Westeros as a prisoner, and he goaded her into freeing his hands and giving him a blade, and they fought on a bridge over a river until both of them were exhausted. She won. He was starved, filthy, weakened by months in a cell and still wearing shackles on his wrists, and he says so himself afterwards at length, bitterly, and he is right too. It is not a fair result, and she would be the first to say so. But watch what she actually does in that fight, because it is very instructive. She does not try to outfence him, because she cannot. She uses her reach. She keeps her weight low. She absorbs what he sends, and she forces the fight to go long, because she knows to a certainty that she is stronger than he is at that moment, and that every second favours her. It is the same insight Bronn had in the Eyrie, arrived at by a completely different route. Do not fight the fight your opponent is best at. She fights, over the following years, some of the worst people alive, in the worst circumstances, and comes out of every one of them scarred. She takes a bite out of her own face from a madman in a cellar. She keeps going. She keeps her oaths, all of them, to a dead woman, past the point where any reasonable person would consider herself released, and she goes on searching a ruined country for a girl she has never met and would not recognise. She is not the most naturally gifted fighter on this list. She may be the most determined person in the entire story, and the closest thing she ever gets to what she actually wanted, which was simply to be taken seriously, arrives very late, from a man who spent their first year together insulting her. Sixth, Prince Oberyn Martell, called the Red Viper. Dorne is not like the rest of Westeros and never has been. It is a desert principality in the far south, hot and mountainous and poor in water, and it is the only kingdom the dragons never conquered. Egan the Conqueror came at it twice with fire, and both times the Dornish simply disappeared into the sand and the mountains, and made him pay for every well, and eventually Dorne joined the realm by marriage, on its own terms, centuries later. They have their own law. Their daughters inherit equally with their sons. They have never entirely stopped being an enemy. Oberyn Martell was the second son of that place, and he was, by any measure, one of the most dangerous men alive. He was sent to the citadel as a boy and forged several links of a maester's chain before he grew bored, and the links he chose to forge were the uns concerning poisons and medicine. He then went east, and did what a great many restless young lords do, and almost none of them survive, which is to spend nearly a decade as a sellsword in the free cities and beyond. He founded his own company. He fought in the pits and the disputed lands. He came home in his 30s with a reputation, 8 illegitimate daughters, and a style of fighting that nobody in the Seven Kingdoms had ever had to answer. He used a spear, not a lance, not a pike, a fighting spear, light and long, often with a shortened haft for close work, and he used it the way a Braavosi uses a rapier, at a distance, with the point moving constantly, striking and withdrawing before anything can be done about it. He wore very little armour by Western standards, supple leather and scale, choosing speed over protection, and he poisoned his blade, and he did not pretend otherwise. That is why they called him the Viper. He had fought a duel years earlier over an insult, and had wounded his opponent only lightly, and the man had died screaming 4 days later, and after that nobody in the Seven Kingdoms would meet him on any excuse at all. His purpose in the story is grief. 16 years earlier his sister had been married to the Crown Prince, and when the capital fell at the end of the rebellion, she had been raped and murdered in her own chambers by a man in Lannister service, and her infant son had been killed in front of her, and her daughter of 3 had been stabbed 100 times. No one had ever answered for it. Dawn had asked. Dawn had been given excuses and then apologies and then silence. Oberyn Martell had spent 16 years waiting for someone to be foolish enough to give him a legal opportunity, and then, in a courtroom, a Lannister asked for a trial by combat and could not find a champion. He volunteered before the words were finished. "We are not going to walk through that duel blow by blow, because that is not what we do here, and because the shape of it matters more than the choreography." He was fighting a man nearly 2 feet taller and perhaps twice his weight, in full plate, with a great sword that most knights would need 2 hands to lift. There was no version of that fight that Oberyn could win by strength, so he did not try. He circled. He kept the spear point in his opponent's face, high at the eye slits, forcing the man to keep his head up and his visor down in the heat, and he never once stood still. He wore him out. He wounded him again and again in the places where the armour joins, and each of those wounds carried something on it that would not stop working. And he had it won. That is the terrible part. The giant was on the ground. The spear was in him. The poison was already in his blood, and the fight was over in every meaningful sense. But Oberyn had not come there to win a fight. He had come for a confession, and so instead of finishing it, he stood over the body and demanded again and again in front of the entire court that the man say his sister's name and say who had given the order. He got close enough to be grabbed. 16 years of patience and one of the finest fighters of his generation, undone by the single thing he could not let go of. He would have thought it worth it. The poison did its work over the following weeks in a room the maesters were not allowed to enter, and the screaming went on for a very long time, and in that sense Oberyn Martell won the duel after all. He simply was not alive to see it. 5th, Sir Gregor Clegane, called the Mountain That Rides. There are perhaps 4 people in the recorded history of this world who were genuinely physically frightening to look at, and he was one of them. He stood very near 8 feet tall. The accounts vary between just under and just over, which tells you something in itself, because men do not misremember the height of ordinary people. He was proportioned like something built rather than born, with shoulders that would not fit through a common doorway, and arms thick enough that his armourers had to work in plates twice the usual thickness. His plate alone weighed more than a small man. His greatsword was 6 feet of steel, and he swung it one-handed, which is not a flourish. It is a physical impossibility for essentially everybody else, and it meant that he could carry a shield at the same time as a weapon that should have required his whole body. He was raised to knighthood at 17 by the Crown Prince himself, and there is no record of anyone objecting, because by 17 he was already the largest man in the Westerlands and useful. What he actually did with it is a list nobody enjoys reading. He held his brother's face in a fire when he was 11. He is widely believed to have killed his own father and his sister and his first wife, and there was never an inquiry. At the sack of the capital, he went up the stairs of the royal apartments and did the thing to a Princess of Dawn that the entire realm then agreed to stop discussing. In a tourney at King's Landing, he killed a young knight by accident, or possibly not by accident, with a splintered lance through the throat, and then when he lost his next tilt he beheaded his own horse in the lists in front of the crowd and went after the man who had beaten him with a sword. He was not a warrior with a temper. He was a permanently enraged animal in the shape of a person, and he was given lands and a knighthood and a command because the Lannisters had found a use for him, and the use was terror. He was sent into the Riverlands with a few hundred men and instructions to be as bad as he could be, and he burned and killed and hanged across half a kingdom, and he was very good at it, and the whole point was that the crown could disown him afterwards. So how good was he actually as a fighter? This is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing, because there is a real school of thought, and it is not a stupid one, which says that Gregor Clegane was a lumbering brute who won on physics alone, and would have been beaten by any of the top 4 names on this list. The counter-argument is simple. Physics is not a lesser form of skill. It is a condition of the problem. Everything a swordsman is trained to do assumes an opponent within roughly the normal human range, and Gregor was not in it. Parrying is meaningless when the incoming weapon weighs what his did, and comes down with that much mass behind it, because the parry breaks your arm and the sword continues. Ducking under a guard is meaningless when the guard is at the height of your head. Cutting is meaningless against armour that thick. The techniques do not fail because the swordsman is bad. They fail because they were designed for a different animal. And he was not slow. That is the part people forget. He was slower than Oberyn Martell, but essentially everyone was slower than Oberyn Martell. Against ordinary knights he was quick enough, and the combination of that reach and that weight meant that a man's first mistake was also his last. What actually beat him, in the end, was a spear that never let him close, and something on the point of it that steel could not stop. And even then the story is not finished, because what happened afterwards is one of the ugliest things in it. He should have died in days. He did not. He lingered, swelling and blackening, screaming behind a door in the Red Keep, and a disgraced maester who had been stripped of his chain for experiments the Citadel called unnatural, asked for the body and was quietly given it. In time a new champion appeared in the Queen's service, enormous, in full plate that never came off, who did not eat and did not speak, and did not seem to need to sleep, and who was never once introduced by name. The realm looked at that thing and chose, as it had chosen with the burned boy and the dead princess, to say nothing at all. Fourth, Sir Jaime Lannister, called the Kingslayer. He was born beautiful, rich, gifted and hollow, and the story spends 5 books slowly and painfully filling him in. The talent was obvious from childhood. He was a natural in a way that cannot be taught. The sort of boy who picks up a sword at 4 and is better at 11 than grown men who have trained since they could walk. He was left-handed as a child, and was made to learn the sword right-handed as most were, and became so good with it that nobody remembered which hand had been his to begin with. He earned his spurs on campaign at 15 in the Kingswood, hunting a band of outlaws through the forests south of the capital. It was a real war, small and vicious and unromantic, and he acquitted himself so well that he was knighted in the field on the morning after a fight, kneeling in a wood, but the finest knight in the 7 kingdoms. He remembered that morning for the rest of his life, and measured every later day against it. At 15 he was named to the King's Guard, the 7 sworn brothers who guard the king, the youngest man ever raised the white cloak. It should have been the summit of any knight's life. It was, in fact, a trap set by his father's enemies to disinherit him from the richest lordship in the realm, and it worked, and he did not understand it until much later. Then came the year that defined him. He stood at the door of the throne room while a mad king burned people alive and listened to the screaming, and he was told by his sworn brothers that their vows required them to stand there. He learned that the king had ordered the city burned to the ground with 500,000 people in it, rather than surrender, and when it came to it, he broke every oath he had, and killed the man he was sworn to protect, and sat down on the throne with his blade across his knees to wait. For that the realm named him Oathbreaker for 20 years, and no one ever once asked him why he had done it. He never explained. He decided, somewhere around the age of 17, that if the world had already made up its mind about him, he might as well enjoy being the villain, and he spent 2 decades being flippant and cruel to protect a wound nobody knew was there. As a fighter in his prime, he was, by broad agreement, the best living swordsman in Westeros. Not the strongest, not the most experienced, the best. He fought with a kind of arrogant fluidity that made it look like recreation. He was extremely fast, and he had a habit of talking through fights that made opponents angry and made them make mistakes. A Knight of the Reach, who was himself a tourney champion, said flatly that Jaime Lannister was the finest sword he had ever seen. Barristan Selmy, who was not generous with praise about anybody, put him in the same conversation as the great men of the previous generation. He rode down the field at the Whispering Wood, cutting his way straight toward the northern boy who commanded the enemy, trying to end an entire war personally by killing one man in the middle of his own army. It did not work, and he was pulled down and captured, but the attempt itself tells you what he thought of his own ability, and it was not a foolish thing to think. And then a sellsword in the Riverlands, for no reason except spite, and to make a point about ransom, put his right hand on a block and took it off with a cleaver. That is the hinge of his whole life. Everything he was, everything he had ever been valued for, everything he had built his identity on since he was 4 years old, gone in an afternoon. He nearly died of the wound, and then nearly died of wanting to. He wore the hand on a cord around his neck until it rotted. What he does afterwards is, for me, the most interesting thing about him as a fighter. He starts again. In his late 30s, a man who was the best in the world, he goes to a mute executioner in a courtyard at night and asks to be taught to hold a sword left-handed, and he is bad at it. Genuinely bad. He is beaten by a man who cannot even laugh at him properly, night after night, and he keeps coming back, and he never becomes what he was, and he knows he never will. He was a great fighter. He becomes, only after he stops being one, something like a good man, and the story is very clear that the 2 things happened in that order, and possibly for that reason. Third, Sir Barristan Selmy, called Barristan the Bold. He got his name at 10 years old, which is absurd, and the story is true. He was a squire, and there was a tourney, and he was not permitted to compete, so he borrowed armour, put on a mystery knight's helm, entered the lists under a false name, and rode against grown men. He was found out and sent home in disgrace, but before they worked out who he was, he had unhorsed a prince of the blood, and the prince, who had a sense of humour about it, called him Barristan the Bold, and the name stuck for 60 years. He was knighted at 16. At the age of about 23, he ended a war by himself. There had been a series of rebellions by a rival branch of the royal family, and the last of them was led by a man who was one of the physical horrors of that century, a pretender so large and so deformed and so strong that his own men were frightened of him. The war was going badly, and at a battle in the Stepstones, Sir Barristan Selmy cut his way through the fighting to reach him, and challenged him, and killed him in single combat, and the entire rebellion collapsed on the spot because there was no one left to rally to. That is the sort of thing that happens in songs. It is not supposed to happen in a chronicle. It got him his white cloak. Then he did it again in a different way at a town on the coast where the king had been taken hostage by a rebellious lord and was being held in a dungeon under threat of immediate murder if anyone assaulted the walls. The army could not attack. The siege could not be broken. So Barristan Selmy went in alone, at night, over the wall, into a hostile fortress, found the dungeons, found the king, and got him out. Every man who knew about it, including men who despised the king personally, agreed that it was the single most remarkable feat of arms in living memory. Then a rebellion came, and he fought on the losing side because that was where his vows put him, and he was cut down at the trident with 12 wounds in him and left for dead in the mud among the horses. When they found him alive, the new king pardoned him before the words were out of anyone's mouth, and asked him to serve, and made him Lord Commander of the King's Guard, because a realm does not throw away a man like that over which banner he had been standing under. He served 3 kings across 4 decades. He was by the end an old man with white hair and a stiff shoulder, and the boy king dismissed him from the King's Guard in open court to give the cloak to a monster, and stripped him of his title, and offered him a castle and a pension as though he were a retired steward. They sent 5 gold cloaks after him at the gate. He killed all 5. He was in his 60s, on foot, in a courtyard, without armour, and he went through 5 armed guardsmen of the city watch and walked out. Everything after that is the strangest and best part of his story, and it is far larger on the page than on screen. He crossed the sea, an old man alone, went looking for the last child of the family he had failed, found her ruling a city she could not hold, and gave her the last decade of his life. He commanded her guard. He trained her boys. He fought in her wars. And in the version most people know, he is killed in an alley in a foreign city, ambushed and stabbed by masked men, in a scene that exists to raise the stakes for somebody else. On the page, he is not dead. On the page, he is in command of a besieged city, running a war council, making difficult and rather ruthless decisions about hostages and hostages' fathers, and preparing to lead a sortie. And a great many readers consider him one of the most compelling figures still standing. He's the finest example this world has of the 4th kind of greatness we described at the beginning, which is durability. 40 years of it. Not one legendary afternoon, but 4 decades of being the best man in the room and outliving nearly everyone who ever tested it. Second, Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning. Almost everything about him comes to us at second hand, from men remembering him 20 years after his death, and every single one of them uses the same word, which is finest. House Dayne holds Starfall, an old castle where a river meets the sea in the far southwest of Dawn, and they are older than the Rhoynar and older than the Andals and possibly older than the kingdom itself. Their founding legend says an ancestor followed a falling star to Earth and found something in the crater, and from that metal a sword was made. Dawn is not Valyrian steel, it is something else, and there is nothing else like it anywhere in the world. It is a great sword, pale as milk glass, so light in the hand that men who lifted it said it did not behave like a sword at all, and it holds an edge in a way that nobody has ever been able to explain, and it is not inherited. This is the crucial detail, and the reason the title means so much. Any Dane may hold Starfall, but only one who is judged worthy may carry Dawn, and only that person is called the Sword of the Morning, and there have been long stretches of the family's history with no Sword of the Morning at all, because nobody living was thought good enough. Arthur Dayne carried it. That fact alone, before any account of anything he did, tells you what his own house thought of him. The deeds we have are few and they are consistent. He was raised to the Kingsguard young. He was the man sent to deal with the Kingswood Brotherhood, the outlaw band in the forest, and he did not do it the way it had been done before. Previous commanders had ridden through the woods, burning villages, and got nothing, because the small folk were hiding the outlaws and had good reason to. Arthur Dayne went and asked the small folk what they wanted. He listened to them. He arranged for their grievances to be answered, and within a season they stopped hiding the outlaws, and the campaign was over, and half the country loved him for it. Then he found the worst of them personally, a lunatic in a helm who had killed, and worse, across the whole region, and he fought him in the woods and killed him, and afterwards he took a 15-year-old squire aside on the morning after and knighted him in the field. That squire was Jaime Lannister, and he thought about that morning for the next 30 years and never got over it. The men who spoke of him afterwards were not sentimental men. Barristan Selmy, who had killed a pretender in single combat and taken a castle alone at night, said plainly that Arthur Dayne was the finest knight he had ever seen, and that of all the men he had known there was only one he was certain would have beaten him. Eddard Stark, a northerner with no romance in him whatsoever, and every reason to hate the man, said the same thing. And then there is the Tower. At the very end of the rebellion, 3 Kingsguards stood outside a tower in the Red Mountains, and 7 men came for them, and there was no negotiation and no surrender. 8 men died there. 2 lived. And the man who survived it said afterwards that Arthur Dayne would have killed him, without question, without difficulty, and that the only reason he walked away from that tower was that his companion, an unremarkable little Crannog man from the swamps of the north, did something in the middle of the fight that nobody ever wrote down. Ned Stark won and knew he had not won. He took Dawn back to Starfall himself personally all that way and handed it to the dead man's sister, which is not something you do for an enemy. That is the entire file. A campaign settled by listening. 1 duel with a madman. 1 morning in a wood with a squire. 1 fight at a tower that he lost only because of an accident. And 40 years of the best fighters in Westeros agreeing, without argument, that he was the standard. He is second on this list. And now we have to talk about why there is nobody at the top of it, the greatest of them all. Here is the confession that has been waiting since we began. There is no first place. There cannot be one, and any list that tells you otherwise is selling you something. Consider what we're actually comparing. Arthur Dayne at his peak, wielding a weapon that has no equal in the world, dead at somewhere around 30. Barristan Selmy, whose peak lasted 40 years and who has more verified feats to his name than any other man in the story. Jaime Lannister, faster than either of them, in his early 20s, before the Hand. Now put any two of them in a yard together and ask who wins, and notice how many questions you have to answer first. At what age? Because Barristan at 23, the man who cut through a battle to kill a pretender, is not the Barristan of 63, and the Barristan of 63 is still good enough to kill 5 men at once. Jaime at 20 is possibly quicker than anyone who has ever lived, and Jaime at 36 is a different fighter, and Jaime at 37 is barely a fighter at all. With what weapon and in what armour? Dawn is a genuine advantage, and it is not a small one. Do we take it away from him? And if we do, is that fair, since the sword is part of who he was? Does Jaime keep his Valyrian steel? Does anyone give Gregor Clegane a reason to stand still? On what ground, and for how long? Because Bronn proved in a single afternoon in the Eyrie that ground and time can beat skill outright, and because a tourney list, a courtyard, a bridge, a cave, a stairway, and an open battlefield are 6 different problems with 6 different answers. And with what evidence? Because this is the part that undoes the whole exercise. Arthur Dayne's legend rests almost entirely on the memories of 2 men, one of whom killed him and felt guilty about it forever, and one of whom was a boy of 15 at the time and worshipped him. That is not nothing. It is also exactly how legends are made. Barristan Selmy's record is longer, better documented, and much less flattering to him personally, and includes 40 years of continuing to be alive, which is the hardest test there is. If you held a blade to my throat and made me answer, I would say Barristan Selmy, and I would say it for the least romantic reason available. Not because he was faster or stronger or more gifted than Arthur Dayne, because he probably was not. Because he did it for 4 decades. Because he was tested more times, in more ways, on more ground than anyone else in this world, and because the surest sign of a great fighter is not one perfect afternoon, but a very long life in a profession that kills people. Arthur Dayne is the finest. Barristan Selmy is the greatest. Those are different words, and the difference between them is the whole argument. And Jaime Lannister, at 20, might have beaten either of them on a given day and lost to both of them on another, which is the honest answer about every duel that has ever been fought. The ones who almost made the list. There are a dozen more who could stand in this company, and it would be wrong to close without them. Robert Baratheon, before the wine and the whores and the throne ruined him, may have been the single most terrifying man on a battlefield in the whole of this story. He fought with a warhammer, which against armour is the correct weapon, and which almost nobody has the strength to use properly, and he fought 3 battles in a single fortnight, and won all 3. And he did not fight elegantly. He simply went forward, and everything in front of him stopped existing. At the Trident he met the Crown Prince in the middle of a river and killed him with one blow, and men said afterwards that the rubies flew out of the dead man's armour into the water, and were still being found there years later. 20 years and 40 stone later, he could not buckle his own breastplate. Khal Drogo led 40,000 screaming horsemen, and had never once been beaten or even unhorsed. He fought with an arak at a speed that made it look like dancing. He killed a challenger in front of his whole khalasa after deliberately letting the man cut him first, to make a point about how little it mattered. And what killed him in the end was a scratch on his chest and an infection, which is the most Westerosi ending imaginable. Syrio Forel was First Sword of Braavos for 11 years, which is not a courtesy title, and he took the post by beating the previous holder. He was small, unarmoured, and used a slender blade in a style built entirely on balance and misdirection. And when armoured Lannister guardsmen came for a child, in his care he took a wooden practice sword off a rack, and went at 5 of them with it, and put several of them down, and told the girl to run. Garland Tyrell is the name nobody knows, and everybody should. He is the second son, the quiet one, the brother of the famous tourney champion, and the story is quite explicit that Garland is the better fighter by a considerable margin, and simply does not care about tourneys. His own father-in-law, one of the hardest military men in the realm, said so. Loras Tyrell, the famous one, was a genuinely superb jouster, with a great deal of natural ability and rather less battlefield sense than his reputation suggested, and the story is fairly pointed about the difference. Grey Worm commanded the Unsullied, who are not really individual fighters at all, but a single organism of 8,000 men with short spears and shields, drilled since childhood to hold formation while cavalry rides into them. As a unit they may be the most effective infantry in the world. As duelists they were never meant to be anything. Dario Naharis fought with 2 curved blades, an arak and a stiletto, and was very good and knew it, and made sure everybody else knew it too. And there are others. Areo Hotar with his long axe, who has stood outside a door in Dawn for 25 years and never once been troubled. Bronzion Royce in armour older than the Andal invasion. Lyn Corbray of the Vale, a vain and unpleasant man carrying a Valyrian blade that has been in his family for 1,000 years. The Smiling Knight, a genuine madman who was good enough that Arthur Dayne had to take him seriously. Sir Ilyn Payne before they took his tongue. Quarren Halfhand, who lost half a hand to an axe and taught himself to fight with the other one rather than retire. And a hedge knight of enormous size and mediocre skill from 100 years earlier, who is remembered correctly for something other than his sword. 2 versions of the same men. We should pause here and be plain about something, because a great deal of the argument about this subject comes from people comparing 2 different things without noticing. Most of the world met these fighters on screen. That adaptation is a fine piece of work, but it compressed a very large story into a limited number of hours, and when you compress, somebody has to lose. Several of the people we have discussed tonight are considerably larger on the page. Barristan Selmy is the clearest case. On screen he is a dignified old man who is dismissed from court, joins the Queen in the east, and is killed in an alley by masked men in a scene that exists mainly to raise the stakes for other characters. On the page he is one of the most important figures in the eastern half of the story. He is not dead. He is running a besieged city, commanding armies, negotiating with sellsword companies, and making cold and morally unpleasant decisions about hostages that would be entirely out of character for the version most people know. His chapters are among the most admired in the later books. Loras Tyrell goes the other way in a sense. On the page he is a serious and rather frightening young fighter who suffers appalling injuries storming a castle. On screen his combat reputation is largely stated rather than shown. Garland Tyrell, who the books say is the better of the two brothers by a wide margin, does not exist on screen at all. Neither does Strong Belwas, an enormous eunuch pit fighter with a belly full of scars who lets his opponents cut him once on purpose to see how they fight and then kills them. Neither does Araya Hutta or Darkstar or Half of Dawn. The Hound's ending differs completely, as we said. There is no clifftop duel with Brienne on the page. There is an island of silent penitents and a very large gravedigger with a limp. Jaime's rebuilding of himself left-handed is a long, humiliating, brilliantly written thread in the books and barely registers on screen. And there is one difference that runs the other way and is worth naming honestly. On screen, several characters become far better fighters than the page has ever shown them to be, because a television program needs its heroes to win fights. The northern girl who trained in Braavos is the obvious example. In the written story, she is a small child with a thin blade who kills people by surprise from behind while they are drunk or asleep or unsuspecting, and who is explicitly not able to beat a grown warrior in an honest fight. That is the whole point of her. On screen, she becomes a duelist. Those are two different characters with the same name. None of this makes one version wrong. It does mean that if you are arguing about who would beat whom, you should first establish which version of each man you're talking about, because otherwise you will argue for hours and never once disagree about anything real. Sword, spear, or strength. There is one last thing to say before we let this rest, and it is the reason a list like tonight's can never be more than a game. We have put 9 people in an order, and they do not belong in an order because they were not doing the same thing. Oberyn Martell fought at a distance with a light spear, poison on the point, wearing almost no armour, moving constantly. That style is devastating against a slow opponent in open ground with room to circle, and it is close to useless in a press of men, or in a corridor, or on a wall, or against 3 opponents at once, or in rain when the footing goes. Gregor Clegane fought by being an obstacle that could not be moved. That style beats essentially everyone in a straight line, and loses to anyone with the patience and the space to stay away from him and let the armour do the work of an oven. Brienne of Tarth fought long and heavy and defensive, absorbing, using reach and endurance, waiting for the other person to be tired. That beats fast opponents who have to commit, and it loses to opponents who are also strong and also patient. Bronn fought by refusing the terms of the fight entirely. Jorah Mormont fought correctly in the plain sense, with no style at all beyond doing the right thing repeatedly. Sandor Clegane fought forward, always, using fear as a weapon before the sword ever moved. Barristan Selmy fought like a man who had already seen this particular problem before and had solved it in the year before you were born. And Arthur Dayne carried a sword made from a fallen star that weighed almost nothing and cut almost anything, which is not a style but is certainly an argument. Ask which of these is best, and you are asking a question with no content. Ask which of them wins on a hot afternoon on flat sand with no armour, and you get one answer. Ask which of them wins in a stairwell in the dark in full plate, and you get an entirely different one. Ask which of them is still standing after 20 years, and you get a third. The Lords of Westeros never understood this, and it is why so many of them died. They believed there was a single quality called prowess, and that it was measured on the tourney field, and that the man who won the tourney was therefore the most dangerous man present. They were wrong about it for 8,000 years, and it cost them constantly. A tourney champion in a good suit of plate on a good horse in daylight is a magnificent thing, and put him in a bog at night with a spear coming out of the reeds, and he is a rich man drowning in his own armour. The legends of Westeros. And so, at the end, what are we actually left with? Bronn, who came from nothing at all and understood before anyone else that honour is a set of rules the powerful invented and can afford, and who died in a bed. Jorah Mormont, who lost everything he had for a woman who did not want him, and then gave the last of himself to another one who also did not want him, and who fought better at 50 than he had at 25. Sandor Clegane, burned as a child and told to call it an accident, who spent his whole life proving that knighthood was a lie, and who behaved, in the end, more like a knight than most of the men wearing the title. Brienne of Tarth, who was laughed at from the day she was born, and who simply kept getting up, and who kept every promise she ever made, including the ones nobody was holding her to. Oberyn Martell, who waited 16 years for one afternoon, and won the fight and lost the fight, because he needed the truth said out loud more than he needed to live. Gregor Clegane, who was not a person, and was made into a weapon by men who found him useful, and who never once had to answer for anything. Jaime Lannister, who was the best in the world at the one thing he valued, and who became worth something only after it was taken from him. Barristan Selmy, who served 3 kings and outlived his own age, and who was dismissed at court by a boy for being old, and who then killed 5 men on his way out of the gate. And Arthur Dayne, who is remembered by the 2 men who saw him die, and by nobody else at all, and whose greatness comes down to us entirely as the testimony of his enemies, which is the only testimony worth anything. They are not really a ranking. They are a set of answers to the same question, which is what a person does with violence when the world hands it to them. One of them used it for money, one for loyalty, one for spite, one for a promise, one for a murdered sister, one because he enjoyed it, one because he was born able to, one because a vow said so, and one, apparently, because it was simply the right thing to do that morning. The swords rust. The armour goes to the smiths and comes back as nails and horseshoes. The tourney fields grow over. Dawn hangs on a wall in a castle by the sea, waiting for someone worthy, and there has not been anyone worthy for a very long time. What survives is the talking. An old knight tells a squire about a man he saw fight 40 years ago, and the squire grows old and tells a boy, and the boy grows old and puts it in a book, and 8 generations later people in a hall are still arguing about who was better. That is the only immortality any of them got, and it turns out to be enough. Sleep well, and if you're still with me, I'll see you on the next journey.